Now Winifred, Win. The eldest daughter of George and Annie Brazel was born in Chesham on the 23rd of June 1894, and at the age of 20 volunteered as a voluntary aid detachment nurse, a VAD. The family had said she always wanted to be a nurse, never expecting this to be in a theatre of war. Prior to this, and quite unusually, she was sent to finish her basic schooling to an Ursuline teaching convent in Belgium at the age of 14. Now, having spoken to the Ursuline movement here, they told me that when a child showed considerable promise and intelligence, it was not unknown for the local education committee to agree to fund this sort of further education. It certainly could not have been afforded by my grandparents, with 9 other siblings to clothe and feed, and all on a butcher's meagre income. Winifred was considered particularly bright by all those who knew her. She signed up in September 1914 and undertook a training course in basic first aid and home nursing, all that was required for a VAD nurse. In May the following year, she was formally engaged as a nurse at the 1st General Hospital, Newcastle upon Tyne, to look after returning wounded soldiers from the front. I say look after because the VAD nurses were not initially welcomed by the fully qualified variety and undertook pretty menial tasks, which ranged from scrubbing floors, laying fires, to dressing and undressing soldiers. After nearly 2 years in Newcastle, without pay, as was the edict of the Joint War Committee, she must have proved her worth, as she was accepted for foreign service in April 1917 to serve in Salonika, Greece, at the 48th General Hospital. The minimum age for serving overseas was 23. Wynne must have been economical with the truth, as she was only 22. Unknown to Winifred, her brother Sidney Sheddles was already there, having arrived in December 1916 with the Army Service Corps aboard the troopship SS Megantic, which incidentally was the same vessel that brought back the notorious Dr. Crippen after his arrest in Canada some years later. Winifred began her tortuous and long journey to Salonika by travelling from Newcastle to Blackpool by train, then on to Southampton via Waterloo. I don't really know if any of the family went to Waterloo, but knowing how close they all were, I would be very surprised if they didn't, and certainly George and Annie must have been there. The personal diary of Edith Moore, another VAD, reads,
"We had our breakfast, packed our few belongings and went off to Waterloo. It was a wonderful sight. Mothers, fathers, sisters, brothers and sweethearts too, all there to see their people off."
I have no doubt that many a tear was shed. On the 19th of April 1917, Wynne arrived at Southampton and boarded a ship to Le Havre, then another train across France, finally arriving at Marseille on the 23rd of April. As France by this time was fully engaged by the Germans, the train could only move at night, hence the 4 days it took for what must have been a pretty horrifying journey. Winifred was only 22, and heaven knows what was going through her mind, and it is very unlikely she had the faintest idea where she was going. Together with 59 other nurses, she awaited her call to duty at a tented camp in Carcassonne for some 9 days. Well, I can't stand camping for 1 night, let alone 8, but this was nothing compared to what was to come. It was the norm, apparently, to check the daily lists to see when and where you were going to be sent. Winifred, therefore, still had no idea where she was going. On Wednesday, May the 3rd, 1917, Sister Hayward, a qualified nurse with the 48th General, wrote in her personal diary,
"Great excitement reigns in the camp today. We hear 65 of the 48th and matron are leaving tomorrow en route for Salonika. Everyone rushes to the list. I am one of the number to go, and I'm glad, but for one regret. The mail is not in yet."
Winifred was on the list too. The ship that was going to sail into Salonika via Alexandria was the SS Transylvania, built originally as a passenger liner for the Cunard Line to accommodate 1,379 passengers. When the Admiralty commandeered her for use as a troopship, they set her capacity at 3,060 men plus crew. No mention of women, but 66 women were on board, one of them being my aunt, Winifred Mary Emily Brazel. The quotes I'm using for describing the journey on the SS Transylvania are all taken from the personal diaries of Sister Hayward. At 4 a.m. on Wednesday the 3rd of May 1917, the 66 nurses leave their camp at Carcassonne and are transported to the port of Marseille.
12:30 p.m. All on board, cabins allotted. I share with 3 other sisters. Secured an electric fan from the steward, who is quite a good sort. 2 p.m, lifeboat drill. A farce as usual.
At about 8 p.m, the SS Transylvania set sail escorted by 2 Japanese destroyers. About an hour later, some of the nurses practiced lifeboat drill.
After dinner, matron gives us a private rehearsal of what to do if we are torpedoed. We walk to our lifeboat. I am to be in charge of our corridor. Lifebelts always to be worn. Some grumble.
The next morning, all the nurses and VADs were on deck, and their matron tells them yet again to wear their lifebelts continually, and of course they obey.
10:15 a.m, Thursday, 5th of May, 1917. A bang, which those who hear will never forget. There is no panic. Everyone goes to her allotted place. What white faces all around. A Scotch officer tightens my lifebelt, and we are to get in, ladies first. How often I have read but never expected to hear that cry. Private Francis helps me in, and I immediately find my feet wet, but this is a mere detail.
A mere detail? At this stage, the lifeboat has not been launched and is still swinging from the deck.
Matron and all of us are pushed in, plus 3 Tommies, and then the boat is lowered. I really think this is the worst moment. We hear there is no crew. Who will volunteer? 2 sailors come down the rope. Jack acts as skipper. We shall never forget him. Only a lad of 17, but how brave and splendid he was throughout.
I can't be sure if Winifred was on this particular lifeboat, but it would have been very similar, as was the entire horrendous experience. 20 minutes after the first torpedo, a second was fired and the Transylvania was done for. Only 50 minutes passed before she disappeared beneath the waves. The U-boat that wiped her out was a U-63, captained by Otto Schultz. In his book, John Brazel recalls the account as told to him by his sister Win, saying she managed to clamber into an already partially submerged lifeboat with a number of other nursing sisters. Now, I interpret this as if she was in the sea and swam to the lifeboat. Now, she was a very strong swimmer, having spent many summers in the Cygnet swimming baths, which was created by the widening of the river Misbourne at the Missenden end of the town. Once in the boat, she recalled a sister reciting the Lord's Prayer and bailing out at the same time. The surrounding sea was very choppy, and the boat continued to fill, and as she and her compatriots were bailing out, Winifred saw there were a large number of soldiers floundering in the water. One particular soldier was pretty well exhausted and in imminent danger of drowning. There wasn't any room for him to be hauled on board, so without hesitation, she swapped places with him and lowered herself into the waves. where she stayed clinging onto the ropes around the lifeboat for some 6 hours. For this act of extreme bravery and selfless courage, Win was mentioned in dispatches. At about 4 p.m, an Italian fishing boat rescued her and others and took them back to Savona, a small town in the Gulf of Genoa, northwestern Italy. There were headlines and articles in the newspapers all around the world. The Melbourne Argus said,
"Lost SS Transylvania. Splendid conduct of nurses."
New York Times,
Nurses were also on board and showed splendid self-possession. When, after the cry of women first was raised and the women were being lowered in the lifeboats, one of the women called, "Give us a song, boys." To this, the soldiers at once responded, singing first Tipperary and then, with a touch of grim humour, "Take me back to dear old Blighty."
412 lives were lost in this appalling tragedy, including their captain, Lieutenant Brennell, who was the very last to leave his ship. He was seen diving off the bridge, awash with water, into the turbulent seas. Although he was rescued, he died the next day from exposure. Nursing Sister Hayward too was saved by one of the Japanese destroyers, and after an epic fight for her survival, she says on her arrival,
What a reception we had at Savona. The cheers. We felt quite heroines and had done nothing to deserve it. We must have looked weird, some wrapped in blankets, others in men's coats, and all with draggled wet hair. I saved 2 hairpins only.
Winifred was not unlike Sister Hayward in character, and she too would have been dismissal of praise and cheers. After being looked after by an Italian family, she and all the nurses went by train back to Marseille, arriving at their tented camp on the 9th of May 1917, just 5 days after they had nearly perished. Sister Hayward returned home, but not Winifred. She boarded HMT Minnetonka on the 17th of May 1917 and arrived at Salonika on the 23rd of May. This must have been a quite terrifying journey, which, thank God, was without incident. Winifred and her colleagues were transferred to the hospital ship, the Valdivia, a French boat on loan to the Joint War Committee, moored in the busy harbour of Salonika. The 48th General Hospital was nowhere near ready. A site had been chosen, which, according to its war diaries, was far from ideal. Cramped, and part of the level ground is swampy. There's still no signs of tents by the 13th of June. The Director of Medical Services expressed forcible desires to get them up. Well, that seemed to do the trick, as 10 days later, the hospital was sufficiently ready to accept patients. It was big enough to cope with well over 1,000 patients. Can you imagine what that entailed? Well, I can't really, but maybe the pictures that were coming on that will show you the tented hospital, which gives a small insight into what it was like. I just don't know if Winifred stayed on board the hospital ship in the 4 weeks that elapsed between landing and the hospital opening. However, I'm sure she would have been completely involved in getting it ready. When Win arrived in Salonika, 600,000 British, French, Serbian and Commonwealth troops were involved in the conflict with the Bulgarians. It is doubtful if the nurses had the slightest idea of the living conditions they would encounter. But they found themselves in a land of harsh extremes. They lived in small tents and in an area where water was in short supply. They used canvas bowls to wash. The winters were harsh and very cold, with freezing winds blowing down the River Vardar and spreading across the vast, empty plains. The terrain was hostile and unrelenting. At the night, the nurses in their freezing tents soon discovered that if they failed to wrap a towel around their heads, their hair would freeze to the pillow. But that was just the winter. The horrors and discomforts of the summer were much worse. Flies and ants were everywhere. touching everything. There are also centipedes, sandflies, scorpions, wind and rain. Mice, rats, lizards and snakes got into their tents at night. The July heat generated copious perspiration and a permanent thirst. But the most dangerous and lethal of all were the mosquitoes. Winifred's hospital mainly treated cases of malaria and the awful dysentery. You may think what I'm about to describe is perhaps shocking and unnecessary, but I feel it is very important for all of us to realise what was borne by the soldiers and nurses for our liberty. Malarial symptoms were weakness, fever, vomiting, headache, diarrhoea, aching limbs and trembling, and more often than not it would reoccur, even when there was not a mosquito in sight. The symptoms of dysentery are bloody diarrhoea, nausea, vomiting, stomach pain, huge ranges of temperature, loss of weight and appetite. The first bedpan station was taken into use in July 1917, and on average were emptied 170 times in a 24-hour period per patient. One soldier observed, "The only forces that hold the battlefields in strength are the mosquitoes, and their effectiveness may be computed by thousands of millions." It's utterly surprising that Wynne did not contract any of these foul diseases, but I have no evidence that she did. Maybe because she was vigilant in wearing anti-mosquito veils, gloves which came up to her elbows, and boots, not the best apparel for temperatures in up to 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Among the misery there was a little joy, as you see from the picture of a concert party performing what I think must have been a Christmas show at Wynne's hospital. Did she have a hand in it? Well, she wasn't on the stage because they're all blokes. But maybe she directed it, as she directed me in a nativity play at Little Missenden Church in the 50s as Mary, Mother of Jesus. Now that is hard to imagine. But I recall her being very strict, particularly about my costume, which I loathed wearing. The other thing that occurred to me was there must have been the most wonderful camaraderie between all the nurses. And as times went on, the VADs began to be respected by the qualified sisters. I guess this is reflected by Wynne being awarded 2 Scarlet Efficiency Stripes. This is a sign she had served at least 2 years in military hospitals and had proved to be a competent worker. In all, her hospital treated at least 21,000 patients. After 19 months in Salonika, Winifred returned home via Malta. And it was here, I like to believe, she met up with Jim Gilbert of Amersham, who, if you recall from earlier, served in the Royal Horse Artillery. Jim was in Malta being treated for malaria and dysentery. He said in his broad Bucks accent, "Ah, she were a lovely gal to me at that hospital. Very, very kind." Well, how right he was.